The growing fear South Florida will take a direct hit, and it could be catastrophic. Irma's uncertain path is causing anxiety up and down the southeast coast.
If you stay and you think you're a tough guy, then you're on your own.
GasBuddy.com reports that more than a third of stations in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale area have run dry.
Those that do have gas, prices have increased. Take a look at this. More than $7 a gallon. This was immediately investigated as the price went up.
In Florida's capital, a price gouging call center.
I can do $1,000 per fine up to $25,000 and hurt them, and I can also and will destroy their reputation as well.
When natural disasters like hurricanes strike, it's not at all unusual to see the prices of essential goods skyrocket. Here are some recent headlines from articles about just this happening as a result of the hurricanes that have been hitting the southeast this year. The term that many people use for this sort of behavior is price gouging. Price gouging, defined here, is a pejorative term referring to when a seller spikes the prices of goods, services, or commodities to a level much higher than is considered reasonable or fair, and is considered exploitative, potentially to an unethical extent. In this video, we're going to talk about whether price gouging is truly exploitative or whether it is simply the functioning of markets in response to changes in supply and demand of essential items. We're going to look at two of the markets in which accusations of price gouging are frequently leveled. We're going to look at the market for bottled water and the market for gasoline. Now, these are two markets that are likely to be affected by the imminent arrival of a hurricane, or once a hurricane arrives, demand and or supply in these markets are likely to be changed. We're going to look at demand and supply for these two goods and talk about how changes in demand or supply can cause spikes in the price that might be seen or interpreted as price gouging by individuals who may not have a complete understanding of how supply and demand work. Let's assume that before the arrival of a hurricane, the demand for bottled water is represented by the blue D1 curve here, and supply is represented by the upward sloping blue S1 curve here. Equilibrium in the market before any change in supply and demand is found by looking at the intersection of D1 and S1, which would give us a quantity equilibrium of QE1 and a price equilibrium of PE1. So what will happen to the market for bottled water when there is the expectation of a hurricane about to strike a region? Well, one consequences of the expectation of a hurricane would be an increase in the demand for bottled water. If households expect there to be shortages of clean drinking water following the arrival of a hurricane, it's totally natural for demand for bottled water to rise. Now, this is one of the determinants of demand, in fact. Special circumstances such as extreme weather events can cause demand for different goods to rise. So how does this increase in demand affect the price and quantity of bottled water in the short run? Let's assume that suppliers of bottled water, businesses, grocery stores, gas stations, other places where you typically would buy bottled water, decide to be charitable and to keep the price of bottled water at the original equilibrium of P1. Given the new level of demand, let's examine how the market equilibrium will be affected. If the price of bottled water remains at P1, yet the demand is shifted out to D2, then the quantity demanded of bottled water will increase to, I'll put a dotted line down here, we'll call this QD. The quantity demanded at the new level of demand of D2 is greater at a price of P1 than it was at the original level of demand at D1. Here's the problem with the price remaining at P1, however. Based on the law of supply, only an increase in price would create the incentive for suppliers to increase their quantity. Therefore, if the price remains at PE1, then the quantity is going to remain here at QE1, which will now be the new quantity supplied. We have a term for a situation in which the quantity demanded for a good exceeds the quantity supplied. This is what we call excess demand. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. The term we have for this is a shortage. Assuming the price of bottled water remains at PE1, it's not unsurprising for a shortage of bottled water to emerge. There's another way we can analyze the consequences of this shortage. If we look at the quantity of QE1 and we go up to the demand curve of D2, we can see that the amount that households are willing to pay, in other words, the marginal benefit that consumers receive from a quantity of QE1 or QS in this case, is greater than the marginal cost of providing QE1 or QS. So the marginal cost, which is represented by the supply curve, the marginal cost is supply, the marginal benefit is demand. At a quantity of QE1, the marginal benefit, in other words, the amount of benefit that consumers derive from the last unit of bottled water produced exceeds the marginal cost of providing it. This is an inefficient market, and there is what we would call a dead weight loss, represented by the white shaded triangle here. This white shaded triangle represents how much better off society would be if the price of bottled water were higher and the quantities supplied of bottled water were greater. However, the law of supply tells us that if the price remains at P1, quantity supplied will not change. One of the perhaps less appealing aspects of market economies is that producers and consumers respond to incentives. Only if the price rises will the providers of bottled water have an incentive to supply a greater quantity. So let's show what that would look like. Let's say that the price does rise. Now, many critics might call this price gouging. Sellers, gas stations, grocery stores, other potential sellers of bottled water could be accused of gouging consumers, exploiting consumers in their time of need. A hurricane has caused demand for bottled water to increase. How could sellers possibly increase their price when so many people need this essential resource? The fact is, a higher price sends a signal to suppliers to provide a greater quantity. Likewise, it creates an incentive for consumers who may be tempted to buy more bottled water than they actually need to buy a smaller quantity. In other words, buy only what you are really in need of. Don't hoard. Don't store bottled water that you don't need. The higher price here, I'm going to put a little note over here, creates an incentive to conserve or only buy what you need. Only buy. Now that's what we want during a time of emergency. We don't want people hoarding bottled water if they don't truly need it. So what signal does the higher price send to suppliers? This sends a signal to producers to supply more. There are more profits to be earned. Now, is that a bad thing? You could say firms earning profits during times of despair is bad. However, what it results in is an efficient market. I'm going to put our new equilibrium here, where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supply. We end up with the new equilibrium of QE2. There is no longer a shortage. The rise in price has created an incentive for households to only buy what they need, and it has sent a signal to suppliers to provide a greater quantity of bottled water. We're going to take some notes down here at the bottom in just a minute, but let's go through one more example here. We're going to look now at the market for gasoline. Now, gasoline's something that depends on offshore oil rigs. It depends on transportation infrastructure to get the product from one place to another. So what we're going to look at now is how a hurricane or some sort of natural disaster might cause a change in the supply of gasoline due to the factors of production being negatively affected by the natural disaster in question. So let's assume a hurricane comes and knocks several offshore oil rigs out of production, or we could say it takes several onshore refineries out of production because these refineries lie right in the path of the hurricane. Now, we're not going to look so much at how demand is affected for gasoline, although we could, because demand for gasoline might increase during a natural disaster for the same reasons that demand for bottled water does. Rather, in this case, we're going to look at how the supply of gasoline is affected. If supply decreases, as we learned earlier, a shift left of the supply curve represents a decrease in the supply. Supply decreases because of the natural disaster. Supply chains are cut off, refineries are shut down, offshore oil rigs are taken out of production. How is this going to affect the price of gasoline? Well, let's assume that there are price gouging laws in place. Let's assume that the government has threatened to take action against any gas stations that raise their prices. Therefore, gas stations are forced to keep their prices at the original equilibrium of PE1. Well, predictably, this is going to lead to a shortage of gasoline. In this case, the quantity supplied will be lower than the original quantity demanded, which will not change. Now remember, we're not even accounting for the potential increase in demand that could occur in this market as a natural disaster strikes. Even without that, the decrease in supply caused by the disruption of supply chains will cause a disequilibrium in this market in which the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. Once again, we are faced with a shortage of an essential resource. Price gouging laws or regulations against price gouging have resulted in a shortage. At the actual level of output of QS in this market, we now have a situation in which consumers are willing to pay more. Remember, the demand curve represents the willingness to pay or the marginal benefit of consumers. The marginal benefit exceeds the actual cost of providing gasoline at this level. So marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost. Society is worse off than it would be if the price were higher by an area represented by the white triangle. This again is our deadweight loss. The market is inefficient because the price has not risen to adjust to the decrease in supply. There is also a shortage of gasoline, so therefore thousands or millions of consumers are not even able to get the gasoline. So what good is a lower price if you can't even get gasoline in your tank? Well, what needs to happen to restore equilibrium in this market? Just like in the case of bottled water, the price of gasoline has to rise. As the price rises, refineries in other parts of the country, producers of gasoline in other parts of the country are going to have an incentive to send gasoline to this part of the country. They'll put it on trucks, they'll put it in tankers, they'll load their trains up and send gasoline to the gas stations in the part of the country affected by the natural disaster. Likewise, consumers will have an incentive to conserve. They'll only buy what they need. They'll only buy what they need. They won't be filling 5-gallon tanks with gasoline just to store it in their garage in anticipation of the need to flee later on. Rather, they'll buy what they need and they won't hoard gasoline. So the arrows here represent, once again, the signaling, this is our signaling function, and the incentives, the incentive function of prices. The increase in price signals suppliers all over the country to send a greater quantity to the region where prices have risen, and it creates an incentive for households to conserve and to only buy what they truly need. In that way, our shortage will be eliminated. We'll have a new equilibrium price of PE2 and a new equilibrium quantity of QE2. So prices play a very important role in the market system. Prices act as an incentive to consume only what households need. Only what households need. Households will have an incentive to consume only what is truly needed if the price of a resource rises during or after a natural disaster. In a similar way, prices send a signal to firms to allocate more resources or less resources if the price falls for a good towards or away from a market as a result of a change in demand. So firms respond to the signals that prices send and reallocate resources based on how prices are changing. So let's go back to the original stimulus for this video. The hurricanes hitting the Southeast caused the prices of bottled water and gasoline and other essential resources and goods to rise. Is this price gouging? Is this truly exploitative, as some people would claim? The purpose of this video was to point out that in fact price gouging might not be what's going on. It might be markets adjusting to real changes in demand and supply. Prices rising is not exploitation, it is how markets reallocate resources through the incentive function and the signaling function to make sure that there are no shortages of essential goods, especially during times of emergency like hurricanes.